Welcome, everyone, to the ITS seminar today. I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kara Kockelman, who is professor and William J. Murray Jr. Fellow in the Department of Civil and Architectural and Environmental Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. Lucky for us, she's on sabbatical this quarter at Stanford, and so we were able to twist her arm and persuade her to come up and visit us for the day. Really fascinating topic. I think that explains why we've got so many folks here and probably lots of folks out there on the internet somewhere. And with that, let's welcome Kara, and I'll turn it over to her. Thank you.
No persuasion needed, actually. I was the one who made the contact. I emailed Dan Sperling back in the summer, and fortunately he and Anne-Marie were able to schedule me, so I definitely wanted to come up here, and I'm just delighted to see you all. I really appreciate your coming over to this side of campus on a Friday afternoon, a beautiful day. I've done this work with Dan Fagnan, who's a doctoral student at UT. He's graduating, and I guess you guys are hiring, so he may be back in the springtime if he's lucky, and presenting further work in this vein. So he's been working in this area just for a year or so. He's done a lot of different things at UT, and wishes he could be here to present this today, but I'm the lucky one. You can see a couple images here of a Google car that you've probably seen on the highways. They've logged 500,000 miles now, so 500,000 miles on California roads testing. This is good weather, daytime conditions, usually no ice and slippery, reflective pavements, but they're very excited about their technology. A kit that could be added to a lot of vehicles potentially, or joint venture with Toyota, something like that. And then many of you will recognize the little Car2Go there. We have Car2Go program in Austin, and it has a 40 square mile geofence. The second part of this presentation today is going to show you kind of like a 100 square mile geofence shared vehicle application where the vehicles can self-drive to get to the traveler that has called the trip. And so this would be level 4 automation. These are vehicles that you just tell them your destination and they are supposed to do the rest. So Google's very excited about this technology, as are the rest of us, I think, and I'll try to use this if I may. So Sergey, who's not on the self-driving vehicle team, but of course is one of the heads of Google, is expecting by 2017. It's a very bold statement. We're really lucky that these upstarts, these young technologists are taking the lead, just like they did with electric vehicles through Tesla, and pushing the traditional manufacturers to go faster and the insurance companies to really take a second look because they'd been dragging their heels, potentially for decades. But of course, we've had lots of technological advances that are helping here speed this up. And okay, I've messed it up already. So is Ning here? Or bring this down in case that happens again. And we've lost our technologist. Whoop. This is not my laptop, by the way. Should have stuck around, huh? And so Susan on here, press the forward arrow. Anybody want to study this? Young people, yeah, younger than me. What did I do wrong? So you're going to guess that button? Okay. Yeah. That's one of my concerns, actually, about having cars that are too smart, because we will forget how to drive. And, we're already pretty lazy and fat in this country as it is, so I'm really worried. There'll be a few people who are, able to survive on their own, and the rest of us will be too handicapped. I'm okay now. Yes, I'm going to use a different button. Anyhow, there's lots of reasons, and the biggest reasons is crash cost savings, because so many crashes are caused by things that really should be avoided: alcohol, drugs, fatigue, and then just basic driver error being a key factor, in the great majority of crashes out there, according to the police, who arrive on the scene and have to assess the primary reasons for the crash. And these are very expensive, much more expensive than congestion and air quality costs each year. So I do a lot of crash analyses, too. I love data analysis for transportation policy, and we've got, a lot of loss of life and just a lot of loss of money every year in this country. So these vehicles, they're not going to get drunk. They're not going to fall asleep typically, but they still can make mistakes. And so they will still, come with insurance policies. And the congestion, of course, is another concern that a lot of people would love to see resolved by vehicles tightly platooning or being given directions about when to arrive at the intersection so they can form mini platoons and share that space much faster. And, of course, eco-driving, too, as they can anticipate things. They can see 4 cars ahead, potentially, and tell that there's a shockwave coming back through the traffic stream. And so at low adoption rates, you'll see benefits of traffic smoothing to everybody because these vehicles will be able to anticipate. And then as you get closer to 100% adoption out there on the road, then you've got plenty of vehicles adjacent to other smart vehicles, and so you can have cooperative adaptive, because those are those tight platoons. They're not going to be very long. They're not going to be like trains. They'll probably just be 4 or 5 vehicles, because once they get too long, they're hard to, they affect merging and diverging a lot. But those will also have draft reductions, as you can imagine, so fuel savings because of the lowered coefficient of drag. And then, they also reduce, so you'll see some congestion benefits of reduced crashes. So these two things play together a little bit. We hope to see car sharing and ride sharing because these are smart vehicles. They know where the next, traveler is. They don't have to look at a map or anything. It's already on board. We'll see lots of people who presently stay away from driving at night or driving altogether, being able to go see friends and family and doctors without having somebody assist them necessarily. Don't know that we're going to let children head out, right? Maybe if you're 16, but I don't know that we want to let our 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 3-year-olds out there without an adult on hand. Parking benefits, there's things like being able to park in lower cost parking locations and saving parking spaces, especially if we share the vehicles. So that's a nice opportunity, but we are worried about making driving too easy and parking too cheap, and then that's going to create a lot more VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. The plot I have here is actually vehicle utilization over the course of a day. So the light-duty vehicle fleet in Seattle over the course of the day, which has much more peaking in the AM and the PM than if you looked at the National Household Travel Surveys, vehicle utilization over the day. And you can see, if you look at all light-duty vehicles reported by the respondents in the Seattle Household Travel Survey, you kind of max out at about 11% on the average day. And if you look at the newer vehicles, you might max out about 16%. And maybe if you looked at the worst day of the year in Seattle, maybe 20% of your light-duty vehicle fleet is in use. Of course, if there's an evacuation, then some people think, well, then we're all going to be using our vehicles maybe, or 50% of our vehicles, something like that. So there are concerns like that you would need people ready to share rides in situations like that, I suppose. Freight movement, this is another one. If you are a truck driver or a taxi driver, I would consider retooling. But yeah, that could save a lot of labor costs, which are a big component of the prices we pay in our stores. And of course, the fuel economies, they're on the order of 5 miles per gallon in commercial vehicles, so lots of gasoline to be saved there. Now, I'm going to show you some estimates of what we think the benefits would be per vehicle or per owner, so from a social perspective and from a private owner perspective. And I'm going to do it at 3 different adoption rates. And so we're taking like 10% of the person trips. We're not looking at freight here, just 10% of the person trips out there and putting those into these smart level 4 autonomous vehicles, and then 50% of those trips. And one of the assumptions we're going to make is that 10% of the people, let's say 1 out of every 10 of those vehicles that comes into the fleet, the light-duty fleet, will be a shared vehicle, and we'll be able to replace 10 standard, conventionally privately held vehicles, and so that's going to have some benefits. And of course, those are going to amplify as we go to higher adoption rates. I want to give you some sense of our assumptions before I show you the tables of the dollar values. And some big part of the assumption is how many crashes are we going to be able to avoid if we have these out there. So each autonomous vehicle, or AV, we expect on the order of 99% crash reductions ultimately. But in the meantime, in maybe at a low level of adoption, there's all these dumb cars out there, so these smart cars can't avoid all their crashes, so that we may see just a 50%. You get rid of those 40% drunk drivers and fatigue-related fatalities, let's say. So we really do expect a 50% reduction, I think, with those initial vehicles if they really are smart and well designed. And then that will creep up, that number will creep up. Won't get to the 99%, which is sort of like flying or taking public transportation, train, let's say. But, so we're trying to be conservative in our estimates of the benefits from these things. We don't expect pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorcyclists to be instrumented in the same way, so they can't behave as smart. So they'll still be crashing. Not as much, though, because the vehicles around them will be getting smarter. On the congestion side, we're looking at other people's work. So people like Steve Schladiver, who's at PATH, and I don't know if you want to move over there. Okay, he has done a lot of work for decades now on platooning of these kinds of smart vehicles, and so we're expecting percentage reductions. And when I say delay, that's in the total hours of delay. So the capacity expansion is not consistent with these same numbers. You don't need that much capacity addition to achieve these sorts of delay reductions because of the convex link performance shape that you've had in your Traffic 101 courses. Not as much benefit on the surface street because you really need vehicle-to-infrastructure investments on the part of public agencies to get those intersections smart and things like that rather than just the vehicles being smart on the roadway. Fewer crashes and tighter platoons and people are not, shockwave, I guess, braking as quickly. Those kinds of things are going to bring some congestion benefits. But, of course, if there's a lot of latent demand and pent-up demand emerging on the roadways, then we're not going to see that benefit. How can we avoid that rebound effect, that terrible, potential rebound effect and really added demand? Well, I think road pricing is the best reason, best policy I can come up with and make it credit-based. So everybody has a budget every month to travel. They can spend it on shared vehicles, shared rides, on trains, on shared bikes. But you all have sort of a budget, and if you exceed that because you travel a lot during peak times of day, between Berkeley and Davis or something, well, then you'll end up paying out of pocket, but at least you'll have a starting budget. So that takes care of some concerns you may have with road pricing. As I mentioned before, 1 out of every 10 of these new autonomously managed vehicles is going to be shared across 10 people. And then there's a little bit of parking savings in the numbers I'm about to show you, and we are expecting some latent demand, or induced demand, I should say. So this is added demand. These vehicles are so easy, people might start heading to Yosemite, 4 times as often now because they can just work or sleep while their vehicle takes them to those kinds of destinations. Okay, so here's some of those numbers. It's not just dollars, it's lives saved, for example. If you use that 50% crash reduction I was talking about earlier at the low level of adoption, 10% of the light-duty vehicles out there, let's say. It's not just economic impacts. I do have some this one line of comprehensive savings and crashes, and that means more willingness to pay to avoid a crash rather than what your economic losses would be. And so pain and suffering, for example, doesn't factor into the economic crash cost estimates that people do, economists mostly. Congestion is rivaling at low levels of adoption. Congestion benefits are rivaling those crash benefits, and then there's some chump change down here in terms of parking savings. And because of the shared nature of 10% of those vehicles, you're seeing the fleet size decrease, but because of the latent or induced demand that we're expecting, that 10% adoption might come with an uptick in actual vehicle miles traveled. This is per vehicle. Most of these numbers he's asking, does this apply to a city? I'm supposed to repeat the question. This is per vehicle, per autonomous vehicle. And this is really at the level of those individually owned vehicles. If we were to do these numbers for the shared vehicles, they're much higher because they're serving 10 times as many people, let's say. But the fleet-wide numbers are still correct across that new fleet of vehicles. We move up to a 50% adoption rate, many more lives saved, many more crash benefits. The congestion benefits go down a bit per vehicle because there's 5 times as many vehicles to spread those traffic flow smoothing benefits across. And so you've already got some of that traffic flow smoothing already because you've got smart vehicles 1 out of every 10 on the freeway might be sensing and avoiding some of those weird shock waves that result in forced flow conditions. And now it's, so that was wonderful for everyone before, and now it's being shared, across a much bigger fleet, so you don't see as big a congestion benefit. And at the 90%, it stays pretty constant on the congestion benefits per vehicle. And these are social benefits. So to all of us, we will all benefit from other people adopting these nice vehicles, and then we will also benefit on the crash side even more. So thousands of dollars potentially per year per vehicle. Now, right now, the cost of one of these vehicles is about $100,000, let's say, and not that you can buy a Level 4. Otherwise, people would be buying them just like they're buying the Model S in big numbers in Palo Alto, where I am right now. So let's look at a slightly different way. We're going to have a net present value on this slide at these 3 levels of adoption. I've got some total benefits. These are in billions of dollars for this country alone. So it's a very interesting opportunity for this country as well as for many others. And then we've we've got the economic and the comprehensive costs here totaled up for you per vehicle. And this is really from the social perspective, because we'd all be benefiting from this congestion and crash savings, whether we own a vehicle or share a vehicle like that or not. But the purchase prices, if you start seeing 10% level adoption, you probably got a marginal purchase price to add this kind of technology to your vehicle of on the order of just $10,000. We know how long it's taken people to adopt electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, which is kind of amazing. You're having to push it through the corporate average fuel economy requirements because people don't do the math. They don't do the spreadsheets to figure out how much they would probably save in fuel costs and buy those vehicles. But these are really interesting. These vehicles can work. These are like buying an employee. Okay, they can do a lot for you. So I expect a lot of sales in the private sector as shippers and maybe traditional taxi cab owners. They start buying these vehicles to serve those same kinds of interests. And here's what it looks like from the private perspective. So if you were to walk into that showroom, what are the prices on the left-hand side that we're seeing maybe today, if we could produce one of these for you, and what they, we'll start seeing mass market production. And in the long term, just $3,000 is what people at Volvo, KPMG, Southwest Research Institute, a lot of people who are kind of leading this technology for a decade now are expecting the prices to potentially get that low. I don't know if it would be a LiDAR device on top the way the Google cars are running. It might be that less expensive version that we have a technologist in Europe advertising these days, which is more like cameras on the 4 corners, that kind of approach to self-driving vehicles. So what I'm going to show you in a second is a bunch of percentages. These are rates, returns on investment. These are internal rates of return over the lifetime of a vehicle. A singly held vehicle, so a privately held vehicle. If I were to show you these for the shared vehicles, they'd be higher, okay, because they're getting 10 times as much use. They won't live as long, so you don't discount over many years, because they, instead of surviving 15 years, like a typical vehicle in this country, they would only survive about 1.5 years before they would be retired from the fleet. They'd get so much use. Anyhow, so I've got 2 numbers across the top. The first is the dollar benefit that you or this particular owner might see per day in parking. So if you work in downtown San Francisco and this car can go find a slightly better parking space for you, you might save $10 a day. Manhattan, out in Davis, I don't know that you'll benefit at all by having your vehicle self-park, a half a mile or 2 miles away if necessary. So the first number is pretty small for many of us, but pretty big for some of these early adopter cases. And the second number is how much less onerous transportation is going to be for you. Usually travel time is worth, $10 to $20 an hour. Maybe Michael Dell, it's $100 an hour. And, then they can now check their emails or rest or have, nice conversation with their companions in the vehicles. They're willing to pay something for that per hour. Their value of time, travel time savings are going to fall, essentially. So that's what the second number is. And you can easily imagine cases where it's more than $10 per hour for that driver, especially the one who can go hands-free now. So many of these cases will put you in the black, or the red, I should say. Many will put you in the black or the green, as we've shown it, and some very high rates of return on that far lower corner. So, and this is for individually held vehicles. If you wanted to share these vehicles, these returns on investment double, and the net present values of those vehicles triple, even though they're short-lived because they're being used so hard. They're only going to survive a year and a half or so. And there are a lot of assumptions behind this. One of them is that these privately held vehicles are getting on the order of the same amount of use as a typical light-duty vehicle privately held in this country. And they're surviving just as long. They can have remote updates of the code, as Tesla is doing with its vehicles right now. People wake up with their Model S's and they do something new because they can remotely reconfigure the code on board, which is neat. And so, I think these vehicles certainly may really survive that long with the periodic code updates, patches like you see on your computer. And then just, not everyday parking benefit, but work days. And, of course, I've already described what that second dollar value was. So. And they all include a little bit of fuel economy savings from eco-driving and that insurance savings from the reduction in the crash occurrence, 50%. Yeah. A little bit. This is from the private perspective, so the congestion benefits are really diluted across all of the travelers out there. I think the 10% is consistent with that 50% crash reduction, so that's one of the linkages there. I'm not sure where else we have a linkage for that 10% adoption number in the final figures. Good question. Okay, so moving on, these are kinds of the benefits, but there's also plenty of barriers. One of them is that very high initial cost for those really early adopters, as you can imagine. But over time, maybe 30 years from now, they'll be at levels that we have seen with hybrid versus non-hybrid technology, or plug-in hybrid versus non-plug-in. The licensing issue is a big one because we have states racing to get these out there. Nevada was a very easy state for Google to convince, and so that's why they've gone first. But California, Florida, District of Columbia, all developing standards, and they could come out different, which would be very tough for a manufacturer, right? And the insurance companies. And so we're hoping for much more coordination, but we don't want to have the feds slow things down too much, I think, but they will have hopefully a great role to play in keeping things consistent and safe and environmentally, sustainable, these kinds of things. Liability has been an issue for lots of innovations in transportation, I think. The attorneys get in the way. I happen to be married to an attorney, and one of the things they worry about is there's these deep pockets now. I guess the GMs of the world and the Fords and the Toyotas, they have been nervous, and their attorneys have traditionally been very nervous about that. But that's why a Google can come in and say, come on, you guys, there's so much money that's going to be left on the table now with the crash reductions that, everybody could be a winner here, I think. And so one of the issues, though, is that because they are pre-coded, they should be smarter than us, and they should be able to make better decisions, so they will be held to higher standards. And we don't want to make those standards so high that it limits the sale and the design of these vehicles. So we don't want to go overboard. They will be safer. What level ethically is enough to convince most Americans that they should be let loose and sold. And then this is an interesting ethical issue. This last bullet point is, you could protect the occupants at all costs and kill off a couple pedestrians, or make your occupants feel that crash hard, but everybody, survives. So that will be, something that the programmers will have to deal with, and that will come out in some legal cases eventually. Right, so the question is about the uninstrumented people having fun in the roadway while these smart cars have to avoid them, and and potentially slow down quite a bit. And so yeah, I've thought about it. I don't know. I'm not designing one of these vehicles, and I think that might come with a high fee or something. And if we have if we're recording who it is that's out there in the roadway, because we can identify vehicles with transponder or better technologies at that point, then I think they will have to pay for that kind of behavior. But a pedestrian, a pedestrian.
So high-tech will know who you are.
Yeah, but I don't think us pedestrians are going to have it, and I can definitely see people jaywalking more often and things like that. They already do it enough, right? It's crazy what students with cell phones on campus do all the time at UT and maybe here as well. And yes, excuse me?
On bikes.
Yeah, cell phones on bikes. I saw that at Stanford the other day. So yeah, it's people may take a lot more risk because they think they can.
Did you say Nevada was a state?
Well, that's what I've been told. Do you feel similarly that Nevada's tough to convince or easy to convince?
The vast majority of the state
Suggestion, speed limit, yeah.
how that may
Yeah, people are worried these cars may be too responsible, right? Like they won't leave the lane to avoid a tire or a chicken in the road or something, and so then they just sit there. But no, of course, that's not going to happen. The designers are not going to be that stuck with certain lane suggestions and things like that. At Nevada, I think it's just going to be a place to do a lot of testing, but I don't know, how many vehicles will be sold in that state. Okay, some other barriers, and many of you have probably been thinking about security. What if these vehicles are not just autonomous, they are connected, and what if those two codes aren't firewalled well enough, and somebody gets into one and infects the others and tells them all to go 70 miles per hour and turn left next week on Monday at 5 p.m. So that's the worst case scenario that people are thinking about. So that's really important when you're dealing with those two types of code, to self-drive and to talk to others. And so they're really going to have to firewall that carefully. And they're fortunate they can. And we do see this whether they're critical infrastructure, whether it's the power grid, okay, that we have to watch out for, water systems and delivery. Public water systems, really important infrastructure, and of course aviation. Now after 9/11, unfortunately, a lot of the plans for automation of our skies were stymied because of what we saw happen in New York and DC to some extent. So I hope this doesn't. I hope the coders and the programmers can make sure this is just a terribly remote reason. But it is a possibility. Privacy for the owners, all this data, wouldn't it be great to share it? Because then we can know when they're coming and we can tell them which route to go on and achieve that system optimal set of assignments that we're told about in our Traffic 101 courses. But, if somebody has that data, how might they abuse it? And so this is really important, and this is a big issue that we're seeing right now in this country with NSA and others. So I imagine that some of it should be shared, but not necessarily all of it. And of course, when you do crash, they do have onboard units that are recording the last, I forget how many minutes, to get a sense of what happened in that crash, and that will be used more and more often to assign blame, I think. As researchers, there's a lot of questions we'd like to see answered, and there was a workshop at Stanford earlier this summer, and that talked about all these different areas and all the open research questions that remain. And it's important to get these things investigated early because of some of those coding decisions, those programming decisions, those vehicle design decisions, and to get them homogeneous or across all providers, and to speed this up and to make it safer. So lots of things I think many of you are probably very interested in investigating yourselves. But in the meantime, with budget issues as they are, we're seeing research dollars fall, and this being left very much to the private sector. I'm going to shift gears now and talk about that shared vehicle application. This is a second paper. What you just heard are some highlights from a first paper, which was released publicly by the Eno Center for Transportation last week in D.C. And the second paper has been on my website for a while, but now they're both on my website. So if you want to read the details, those are both papers you can turn to openly now. And so we're calling these SAVs, Shared Autonomous Vehicles. There's one other person who's been doing some research in this domain, Alan Kornhauser at Princeton. He calls them A-taxis. And Susan Handy, I think, got her undergraduate at Princeton, so she knows Dr. Kornhauser. Okay, so this is the Car2Go, which is that point-to-point car-sharing arrangement that we have in San Diego, Austin, some other places. And, of course, that looks very much like a Google Prius. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, relatively little of the vehicle fleet is in use at any time. You could just look outside and see all the parked assets that are just being wasted, right? Excess capacity out there. And so you can imagine maybe a 5-to-1 replacement, and we see 10-to-1 with people who join car sharing membership or have car sharing memberships in San Francisco and others. We see release of vehicles that they already hold or not purchasing vehicles that they were planning to purchase. And so it might even be closer to 10-to-1, and that's what we're going to see in the simulation, that the rate of sharing can get your fleet down by 90%. So there's a lot of promise here, but still relatively small numbers. Can I see a share of hands? Who is a member of a car-sharing arrangement? How many people in this room? Just 6, maybe? Okay, nobody along here? Okay, well, maybe in the future you will be, especially if that vehicle can come to you. So that's one of the issues is getting that vehicle, getting to that vehicle is a big access cost for those who don't already live in that neighborhood, and then, getting back and not having to pay for the vehicle while it's parked. Then that is what Car2Go allows, but it does have a geofence, and somebody might swipe your car while you're shopping, and so that's a big issue. Now, these vehicles, wherever they are in the system, can come and get you, and so that is nice, but it might add a lot of vehicle miles traveled in some settings, so we're going to look at that too, and in our example, it's about 10% added travel. But the engines are warm all day long, so we get rid of cold starts, Dr. Kleeman, and yeah, so that's what we're going to look at. Now, this is an idealized setting. This is 10 mile by 10 mile. We have a question in the middle. Yeah, 10% deadheading, essentially, empty vehicles. And they're also relocating, not just to pick up, but we have some relocation strategies because if we see them clumping in one part of the region and we know there's going to be more demand in the other part of the region, we start to shift them if we can. So this is like a small city. And one more question, yeah? Great question. Okay, so one of the improvements we made recently is to stop those vehicles for refueling and maintenance in case they get dirty. Some people don't treat rental cars as well as they treat their own cars. And so, yeah, we are stopping them. They're 40 mile per gallon vehicles, and I think it's like a 10%. They have a typical range. But, yeah, the electric vehicle question is something another student of mine is going to be doing for dissertation, it looks like. So really important potential benefits there, but, is it going to be a fast charge? Is it going to be a remote charge, or do you need a human to plug it in? These kinds of things are important questions. And then they will know what range they have left, and they will need to know the destination. It's not going to be like a taxi where you say, show up and then I'll tell you where I'm going. Although some of us do tell them we're going to the airport ahead of time, but a lot of people don't. And so I think Lyft now is the only car sharing or ride sharing arrangement right now where they're asking you to tell your destination before they send you the driver, and I think all should be like that. I think most of us know where we're going. So anyhow, these are quarter mile by quarter mile zones, so there's 40 by 40. There's 1,600 of them in this 10 mile square region, and we've got Poisson based counts of calls being made in these different cells. These are quarter mile by quarter mile zones or cells, and during peak and off peak. So that's what the PK and the OP stand for, and we're every 5 minutes we're seeing who has called and we're assigning the vehicle. So it's not in real time every second, for example. We've got a 5-minute horizon in there, which isn't much, but it allows for some rationalization of assigning those vehicles. And we've got a city that has much more trip generation towards the center. We tried to model it on Austin's densities of population where people might, and we have return trips, so we have them coming back from their destinations at the same rate you see people returning in the National Household Travel Survey, which is 78%. We have random departure times and then return times, so activity times before they call the vehicle again that mimic the National Household Travel Survey. But this is a small region. It's only 10 by 10, so we are cutting off the distance that they can request at 15 miles. So we do not have those long distance trips, which will be harder to serve because they're going to take the vehicles out of the region. And we have this issue with bike sharing arrangements right now that all the bikes end up someplace. Of course, they're not smart enough to bike themselves back, so these vehicles can, fortunately. But if the trips get longer, that gets harder. So this would be kind of a very urban application. And we are not modeling the network. We're assuming they're traveling on the grid. So it's not direct, it's not Euclidean, so it's a little conservative. But they, the speeds at the time of day are high or low, depending on whether it's peak or off peak. And we have lots of different simulations. Sometimes we have higher congestion, lower speeds, or more trip making, these kinds of things. So we set that, and of course we generate the calls every 5 minutes, and when the vehicle's going to need to, or when the traveler is going to want to come back and or go somewhere else completely. And then we start to see how many vehicles we're going to need to meet all of this demand such that nobody waits more than 5 minutes in that initial run. And we take that fleet, that base fleet from that warm start, and we hold that number constant of vehicles, and we feed it 100 new simulations. And, of course, at that point, there will be people waiting more than 5 minutes due to randomness of, in some settings, there will be people waiting more than 5 minutes because we haven't created a big enough fleet to serve everybody. That would be expensive and a waste, really, of resources. And so we're running 24-hour days over 100 days. And, of course, you have the morning and afternoon peaking as you would in a normal region, and very quiet nighttime where the engines do get cold, finally, at night. And then we're reporting the results to all of you. So just to give you a sense, another little flow chart here is each traveler making a call looks for the closest shared autonomous vehicle that's presently available and claims that if it's in the same little cell, that quarter-mile cell, or if it's within 5 minutes of the caller, then that vehicle can be assigned. Of course, it's random, like everybody. We see, who has one in their cell already that's available, and we assign those, and then we look 1 cell away, 2 cells away, and then once we hit the 5-minute limitation, then if this is a warm start, those initial starts where we're deciding the fleet size, we'll generate a shared vehicle to make sure that person gets served within 5 minutes. So a new vehicle is created instantaneously where he is to create that initial fleet. If you're not in the warm start phase, those other 100 runs per scenario, then you're waiting, and that's okay. This is small enough setting and enough vehicles that just waiting, there will be a vehicle almost certainly within 10 minutes. It's only if we start clipping that fleet size do we start to see anybody waiting more than 10 minutes. And then, of course, once you have your vehicle, once it's an occupied vehicle, it is moving, and it'll take oftentimes more than 5 minutes to get to its destination. And so we're counting forward in 5-minute increments and then proceeding on. So there's 4 relocation strategies. These vehicles may end up clumping or clustering in one region during the day. We want to bring them out of that neighborhood towards the underserved neighborhoods because we're anticipating demand in those. So we take this 40 by 40 cell matrix and divide it into 25 blocks that are 2 miles by 2 miles instead of being 10 miles by 10. So we've got these 25 neighborhoods, and those that have excess expected vehicles, so they're kind of clumping versus the demand that we're expecting in the next period based on those Poisson rates that underlie the simulation. We don't really know. People only tell us, every 5 minutes they tell us where they are. So we really don't know. We're just guessing, and if we see more than a 10% discrepancy, we'll push the vehicles out of the neighborhood or we'll pull them in, depending on whether you're 10% high on supply or 10% low on demand. on supply, I should say. So this is maybe the initial warm start location from the evening of the night before after we run that warm start to decide the fleet size. And that imbalance I'm talking about is a relative imbalance, supply versus demand. You're looking for neighborhoods that have more than a 10% discrepancy on that. And so these red areas look oversupplied. These are the 2-mile zones overlaid on these quarter-mile cells. And you see lots of vehicles in a few of them and underserved. And so we start pushing from the red into the blue. And in some cases, the blues are too far away, like this -6 here. So it actually didn't collect another vehicle by the time the next 5-minute interval arrived. But that's fine. A lot of the other imbalances have been addressed to some extent. And so that simple kind of reallocation ends up being quite helpful. It's actually more helpful than the other 3 relocation strategies combined. And so the second relocation strategy was trying this one at a tighter interval, a 1 mile by 1 mile neighborhood. So you, instead of having 5 by 5 of these neighborhoods or 25 neighborhoods, you have 10 by 10, you have 100. And it was not as useful as this more global strategy. Very simple heuristic, easy to code, and worked out very nicely for keeping wait times and travel distances relatively low. The other strategies were more simple, something like I might come up with in a few minutes, looking for these isolated areas, these zeros that have only zeros around them, and so there's no vehicles there right now, and we've got some cells, in this case, these are the quarter-mile cells. I'm just showing 1 2-mile area, or 2 by 2 area here. So there's really 40 by 40 of these, and anytime you see an isolated zero that's surrounded by zeros, you're going to try to push away from heavy cells. And the last strategy was just immediately adjacent cells where the delta, the difference between the heavy cell and the zero cell was more than 3, let's say, so, or at least 3, I guess. So we're seeing that kind of R4. That's the relocation strategy, R4. And R2 through R4 were not as good as R1 in isolation, but we're going to use all 4 of them because they're all easy to code in, and they're all helpful to some extent. So we're going to use all 4 of them in the scenarios I'm going to show you. So here's that city. Easy to code, right, as an initial application, and that inner area has higher rates of trip generation, but they're actually linearly falling as you leave the central business district or the centroid of this region. And it's just this helps with a couple of the other assumptions, this yellow versus white area. And we are going to see one vehicle spend its day making 70 short little trips. 40 of those are blue where somebody's on board. So we're going to a destination with a traveler. And the reds are the either relocation pieces or the deadheading to pick up that waiting traveler, for example. So there's 70 movements over the course of the day for this particular vehicle. He's serving 40 trips, which is very typical of these scenarios. He's got 9 relocation red arrows, and then actually only 9 are kind of red. These other blues, he's on call. So he's headed to pick up a passenger, or he has a passenger, this male vehicle I'm describing. And yeah, you can see these 9 relocation arrows are a mix of strategies. Some of them are crossing from a 2-mile by 2-mile neighborhood to another 2-mile by 2 miles. So this is the R1 strategy you're seeing, whereas this piece looks like an R2 strategy because it's crossing a 1 mile by 1 mile neighborhood. And then most of them are actually R3 strategies that we're seeing in this day of 70 movements, 40 of which are with a passenger on board, 21 of which are going to pick up the next passenger who's called you, you've been assigned, and then the other 9 are these relocations. That's just one example. They happen to end up close to where they started, but that is a coincidence, in case any of you is wondering that. So here's some of the other assumptions that we use. 10 trips per cell per day on the periphery, 40 trips per cell per day in the center. This works out to look like about 4% of Austin's travelers on any given day. So if we took the central portion of Austin, that's about 10 miles by 10 miles, these rates of trip generation just mean that only 4% of the people are participating in this kind of car sharing. You can imagine much higher rates, which will be better because the vehicles don't have to travel as far to find the next user. They'll have much more churn, you'll have a much bigger fleet, of course, but it won't scale. So if you wanted to scale this up by a factor of 25 to make it 100% of users, you wouldn't need 25 times the fleet size, really. You might need 20 times the fleet size to do it. And you can see the speeds are pretty reasonable. We used some estimates based on the National Household Travel Survey and other things we'd read to get those speeds, but of course in reality speeds are very variable depending on whether you're on a freeway or a local street and time of day. And then we had that return share of trips to make it look like regular tours much of the time. So depending on the scenario, depending on those starting assumptions, which get varied a little bit, like we increase the trip rates, we make more people members of this car sharing arrangement or fewer. You can see it replacing 9 to 13, which is a number, those of you familiar with car sharing, traditional car sharing, where they're dumb vehicles, they don't drive themselves to the next person. You see these kinds of ratios, which is interesting. Very different setting, very different phenomenon, but very similar numbers. And then the average wait times are very short because usually there's a vehicle within your cell, actually, because in our case we have about 1,600 vehicles across 1,600 cells. It worked out that way, which is a little interesting. Let's see. Very few people, because the warm start created enough vehicles to make sure everybody in that first random scenario was served within 5 minutes. In these other randomized scenarios that have the same underlying trip rates, we see very few people having to wait. So it suggests this is a little too good. You don't need this big a fleet. We shouldn't have been that generous in the warm start. So you could save a lot of money, and your travelers could save money by reducing that fleet size. Here's that kind of deadheading number, this added drive with nobody. It's not drive alone. The vehicle drives itself alone, and there's going to be about 11% more travel on the base scenario. And you can see very heavy utilization of those vehicles on average. Of course, it varies from day to day because they're each random simulations, but they all have the same underlying base travel calls, and so that should be varied. Saturdays are different from Mondays, and Mondays in November are different from Mondays in July, and things like that, so we'll be doing more variation to get a sense of that.
Sure. The new induced travel, that's just
Great question. Yeah, the 10% or the 11% almost is just the same travel patterns as before by humans, but the vehicles are driving alone to serve that. So we actually expect more induced travel unless pricing or some other policy is incorporated, or people really get interested in sharing. Maybe your trip is free if you share. How are we going to address that genie in the bottle waiting to get out where we make travel too easy? It's already pretty easy in this country. The cold start number is really nice to see. We're using a 1-hour cutoff from cold start versus warm start. And I think Dr. Kleeman can maybe tell us, is it about 50% of light-duty vehicle mobile source emissions are cold start related these days? Okay, I asked several people and they're like, yeah, it's on the order of 50%. And so I think, that's pretty significant. So it'd be great to get that number down, and you'll see in a second some of our calculations based on that. But before, with everybody having their own private vehicle, then most of the engines have waited more than an hour before they're driven again. So 68% versus
Texas.
Yeah, in hot places there may be additional benefits too, but the engines are so hot already in Texas. I think they have to get really high. This is another question for Dr. Kleeman. How hot does the engine have to be before you consider it warm? Does it have to be like 200 degrees Fahrenheit? Yeah, so just the cat.
I was thinking about passenger.
I know. So, yeah, but I do worry. It's a very tough question about how to get that cat, and I think we should all just maybe let the key or the vehicle knows it's going to be started in 30 seconds or something. So start warming that cat with an electric battery that you have on hand, which goes back to the electrification question, and that would help reduce those cold starts dramatically. Cold starts coming down with hybridization. Oh, gosh. Should I hand this to? In this simulation, the numbers I'm about to show you, it's only internal combustion engines. Okay, so here's what I was mentioning. These are some of the emissions estimates. This is for a sedan rather than a pickup or an SUV. In our example, we are assuming that people give up pickups and they give up SUVs, and the shared vehicles are all sedans. But in reality, there will be some pickups and SUVs, and they're not as many as we currently hold because most people don't need that special ability of the vehicle most of the time. But this is cherry picking a little bit by putting all of them into sedans for these shared vehicles. But energy, it goes up on operating emissions because there's that 10% or 11% deadheading, but it goes down because there's fewer parking spaces needed as the fleet slims down by 90%, and much of the time is operational anyway, so it doesn't need as many parking spaces during the daytime, and then those cold starts disappearing. That helps a lot. But there's that added operational energy and emissions associated with that. And so the biggest places we would expect savings are carbon monoxide and volatile organic compounds. And so the CO is from the cold start, I think, and the VOX are maybe also from the cold starts. You can smell that a lot of times, that reactive organic gas in those cold starts. And it would be nice if it would come down more on particulate matter, especially ultrafines, which are not shown here, or NOx, because most of our regions, I think, are NOx constrained for ozone formation.
I'm actually confused about your PM cold start number. Are you saying that there's no PM in cold start right now?
Am I saying that there's no PM10 in cold starts right now? Gasoline vehicles, not diesel.
That might be the way the inventory is coded, but that is
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Whoa.
There is a separate inventory category for VOC and cold start, and maybe for NOx and cold start, and they haven't split the PM yet, but the PM is absolutely different and much, much higher in cold start.
Great, because so he's suggesting for those of you on the webinar that PM number, there should be a benefit here because there's a lot of PM in cold starts, even on gasoline vehicles. So that's great because these are very carcinogenic, especially the 2.5 and the ultrafines. And so we are taking these numbers from, I think, Chester and Horvath, who did some work at Berkeley and are doing life cycle analysis. And so I don't know why we have a zero there. It's probably our fault, not theirs, but that is where we did not get these from the MOVES model, for example. So yeah, I'd love to see the PM show some real improvements there. That would be great. But reductions on everything that we are tracking here anyhow. And yeah, if we go electric, of course, there'll be additional benefits depending on your power source. No, the parking benefits are the pavement, the infrastructure. So Horvath is an infrastructure expert, and Chester has looked at a lot of the life cycle of the pavements and things like that. Okay, so we did 26 other scenarios besides the base scenario and modified a variety of those inputs. And I'm just going to show you here 5 of those scenarios versus the base case. How many trips per day, for example, each SAV was making, each shared vehicle was making on average. And as congestion goes down, the speeds go up, and these guys can zip around to serve more people in less time. So you see that 36 trips per vehicle per day on average going up to 40. But as you slow people down or you don't have as many trips being generated, they have to travel farther to get to the next traveler, or they travel slower, and so they don't get to serve as many trips. Those people having to wait at least 5 minutes, the numbers depend. If you have more congestion, then more people are going to be waiting for those vehicles. Even though we fleet-sized it and a warm start to match that setting, it's still much more likely that we're going to simulate a day where more people go waiting for 5 minutes. And I think most of us can handle 5 minutes. I think most of us are willing to tell them when we're going to be traveling, 10 minutes in advance, right? So this was kind of conservative in that sense. Average wait times all very mild, but if you look at the curves, they're still very mild. If you start taking vehicles away from the fleet, then we finally start to see some people waiting 15 minutes, for example. and the cold start numbers don't change that much, nor do the induced travel percentages across these pretty different scenarios. So that was nice to see some of the stability there. This is a picture, actually, where we take that base case fleet size and we start cutting. So we needed about 1,688 vehicles to serve those 65,000 trips that is a typical day, our base case. And we start cutting that back to 1,600, 1,500, all the way back to 1,200 before we really start to see some people getting upset with the operators of the system because the wait times get so long. So how do you handle those kinds of things in real life? You give them a free ride. Or, people who really need the car now, they pay a premium. So there's ways to, offset some of that pain of this potential thing. And you can imagine that this sort of thing is going to happen if we go from, a typical day to a Giants baseball game day or something. So something unusual, a rainy day. And so you can imagine those kinds of variations in demand that might mimic the sort of variation in fleet we're simulating. And so you can imagine days where there will be a lot of people waiting 20 minutes and maybe you give them the ride for free. Or you give them another ride too the next day for free. And that R1 strategy was the best I mentioned, beating out all of the 3 relocation strategies combined. Very good levels of service, even with these vehicles serving 40 people a day. Of course, these are short trips. These are less than 15 miles, so we're missing that tail. I think the last 3% of trips or something are more than 15 miles, person trips in the National Household Travel Survey. And so some nice energy and emission savings, even though we do have that deadheading occurring. And if we went to even lower density of membership settings or very rural settings, that's where you would start to have some problems where vehicles would be sitting, waiting for the next user, or users would be waiting for the vehicle for too long. So you don't want to necessarily apply this program all over the place unless you're going to charge a premium and maybe only be able to reduce your fleet size by 50% or something in a very rural, low-demand setting. Of course, this was all idealized setting, so we're looking forward. Dan, his thesis, when he comes hopefully to speak to you in the spring, will be about a real network and real region and real congestion occurring and some decongestion thanks to the platooning or something if we have high adoption rates of autonomous vehicles. And there's the eco-driving that we didn't use here, but these vehicles will probably be even more fuel efficient than traditional vehicles because they're just a little bit smarter about their use of the throttle and that kind of thing. And then, of course, we put everybody in one of these shared vehicles, but once you become car-free, you become much more flexible in your mode choice patterns, and so people might be walking a bit more, biking, and training. And, of course, we'd like them to start sharing rides. So that's something else that Dan is working on is the code, the program logic, to help people find the vehicles, figure out the marriage of rides. So if the traveler who has already claimed the vehicle wishes to share a ride, if it makes enough sense, the burden is worth it. Maybe deviation in his route or the payment of the second person who's going to get on board with him is worth it. He will allow that, and so add a new destination to that vehicle's journey, and that's going to be part of his new code. So here are conclusions. I hope this is good timing. We do expect these things and really transformative technology. So lots of people interested in this from many dimensions. We're trying to help the U.S. and others anticipate all those implications. There's a variety, and there's lots of work to be done here. So hopefully some of you will be working on this. Identifying those barriers in advance and suggesting real workable solutions is very important here. To protect all the stakeholders. And then, one nice way to take a look at some of the shared applications benefits is with an agent-based model. Pretty simple to code. Of course, Dan's undergraduate degree is in computer engineering, so he has a bit of a leg up on many of us, but, works nicely, and we hope to see it working for a 10,000 link network with, million trip makers sharing rides, not just vehicles. So I'll leave you with this cute little slide. This is the City Mobile project in Europe. There's 5 cities that are going to be getting different technologies, these kinds of vehicles to pick the route, mainly with tourists and this kind of thing. So I appreciate your attention. I look forward to any questions. Yeah, I've never simulated the loss of a link temporarily, although my students simulate that for regions where there's like a work zone in effect or there's added capacity and things like that. But that's pretty standard travel demand modeling. We weren't doing that at all here. We didn't have an explicit network here. And usually with rain, I wouldn't expect it to affect the network so much. I would expect it to affect demand. That's where the real test would be, and that's very natural to do here, but you just have to anticipate it and set it up as a scenario. So the question is about people wanting to retain private ownership because they have the resources. We're quite wealthy in this country, whether you sense that or not. We have a lot of excess consumption happening every day. And people like to have car seats for their children. I'm not really willing to give that up with little ones. So are the manufacturers going to design vehicles where it's available on every vehicle? You just fold something out of the back seat. What if we have lots of purchases that day? I don't want to carry my gym bag back and forth all the time. So many people will retain a private vehicle. So, but they'll pay for the privilege. They'll pay for that parking spot. And if they send the vehicle off alone to go find a cheaper parking spot, I hope they're being charged a VMT fee. And especially when they're in a downtown, I hope it's high at that time of day. So they hopefully will pay off the rest of us. Right, so this is, in 20 years, those of us who wouldn't consider it may be gone. So let's see those hands again. Who is a car-sharing member right now? Okay, and the average age of these young, beautiful people is about 24. So we need you guys to lead the way. Other questions? Red checkered shirt. So the question is about those vested interests that are right now driving the private commercial vehicles, putting up barriers and roadblocks to these kinds of new technologies replacing their jobs. And sure, we will probably have somebody on board. He will be paid less probably, but he'll be there for safety reasons on those big rigs, because things can happen. I mean, somebody else can crash into you. You don't want a completely unmanned commercial vehicle. I should also mention that commercial vehicles are harder to automate because they're so big. So you need like multiple cameras, and you've got this tractor versus a trailer, and they're often, by different manufacturers or something. They're not as standardized as the light-duty vehicle fleet. So that makes it harder. Taxi cab drivers, are not a very powerful interest. They're often, the ones that many of us experience, are relatively new immigrants with very low skills. And they can, right now, some of them are, maybe becoming Lyft operators, LYFT. It's a shared ride kind of situation. We're seeing actually a lot of people, now that you don't have to have a medallion to be a member of a taxi provision group, you're seeing people buying vehicles actually so they can start selling the space on that vehicle. They're becoming taxi cab drivers effectively overnight. So he just mentioned that low-speed crashes have very few fatalities. That's true. Mike, did you have a question?
So I was wondering about the barriers to adoption of alternative fuels for vehicles, fuel cell or electric vehicles. I wonder if those are the same barriers. Are you talking about the same thing? If people
Yeah, so this is a great question. We're going to see the same sort of barriers, psychological barriers to adopting these vehicles? I think it's a very different thing. It is a new technology, but it's not like a battery dying the day after the 8 or 10-year warranty runs out now, and that's a very expensive fix. But yeah, maybe these systems will need fixes. I just don't think that if the LiDAR system goes out on top of it, I don't know, you run into a low-lying beam or something, and that would be a big fix, actually. So that could be similar to, I think, there's the range anxiety on the battery electric vehicles, of course, which is a very different thing, too. These, have far more benefits. So these are, they're adding a lot of benefits. And, of course, we're not going to jump right into level 4 where you're not allowed to touch the steering wheel. They're going to take us through level 3 first, I think. Most manufacturers are going to have a level 3 type of vehicle where, on the highway or something, yes, you can go to sleep. You will be allowed to go to sleep maybe, or you must be reachable within 10 seconds or something. But, yeah, so it's a very different thing. I'm not sure. That's a great question. We might be able to do a survey.
I was pitching it positive,
Oh, the electrification, yeah, will take care of itself.
Right.
Absolutely. The
This-
range
if you
anxiety
get over
goes
this
away.
hump, then all the other rest of it sort of goes away.
That's a great question, yeah. So I do think electrification is much easier when, it's not your vehicle, so you're not worried about the battery retirement. And then, of course, the range anxiety of potentially, the pure battery electric vehicle also disappears.
Benefit, one benefit that probably didn't mention, sharing car sharing. I think it's for older drivers, they lose their driver license. I mean, when they get older, city to the land use.
So Dr. Zhang's asking, for those of you on the line remotely, about this great set of stakeholders, which are people currently unable to drive at night or all day long. They are some of the biggest fans. They are going to push this. We're going to have AARP behind this finally with all you young people. It's convergence of these generations. So, and then, of course, persons with sight limitations, epileptics who are not allowed to drive, and people on other medications. So that's wonderful. Of course, many people, driving becomes easy. You live further, and you could see more sprawl. You might see less parking, but more sprawl. Fewer parking lots, but more sprawl. I think road pricing is going to be really important here. People should be carrying full freight on those vehicles when they use them. It's the emissions, it's the military investment for protection of those oil lines, if it's not domestic electric energy and things like that. So I really think we do need to get the pricing going before we release these in big numbers. Okay, so there's another stakeholder that might be opposed. He's worried about police officers not having a job anymore, or parking permitters or something, because now you won't, overstay your parking welcome. The vehicle will simply self-move. And, those people will also have job issues. So they may be sent to do other things. I mean, the police do a lot more than issue, speeding violation tickets. And so I have heard this before. Something you're probably not thinking about, but Anthony Lewandowski, who's at the head of this team for Google, has had people say, what about all the organ donations we're not going to have anymore because all these young people aren't going to be dying anymore? And he's like, well, let's hope the biomedical engineers come up with a solution to those organs because, sorry, we're not going to be killing as many people. And so really, the benefits far outweigh those costs. It's a really unfortunate argument that certain groups make. Yeah, so lost revenue from the tickets maybe being replaced by road pricing. And, if you know where the vehicles are, they can get a lot more speeding tickets with much less money through the municipality really raking in the dough. But, yeah, hopefully all the vehicles will behave and they won't have a lot of violations. I'm not sure how that will play out. Yeah, we also should be taxing land very differently, too, in terms of sprawl. I don't know if any of you are reading the Travel Modeling Improvement Program listserv these days, but there's some interesting discussions about land use modeling, and you might want to look into Georgian taxes if some of you are interested in that. Okay. It was not 5 years for widespread adoption, the one-handed comment by Sergey Brin. It was, you will see these vehicles. These vehicles will be available maybe to Larry Page and Sergey. Maybe they will have those parked at their garages. But, yeah, it's just the technology will be releasable. Right now, it's not. I've been in Google vehicles twice now, and they're very careful how they're using those vehicles. Those are sunny days. Those are middle lanes on Highway 280. And great question. So what's the timeline to see the 10%? Boy, it could be 20 years, especially with the slow adoption of electric vehicles and things like that. Yeah.
More hearing your presentation, I was thinking about mode choice issues, and you touched on that at the end of the presentation. My limited knowledge of car share is in dense urban areas. It can have the opposite effect of drawing people, bicyclists, public transit users into cars and actually increase the empty. And hearing about shared automated vehicles, to me it sounds like it's like basically an electronic chauffeur. That would actually, it would even further, might nip bicycling, bicycling being more popular, might nip that in the bud a bit, maybe not.
Right, so the question's about other modes suffering under this marvelous new mode. Okay, so this has lots of benefits, whether you pay for it or not. There's going to be a lot of consumer welfare there that people are going to be chewing on. And, yeah, if they go crazy with it, we've got to rein them in. And pricing, absolutely, again, is the only answer that I have. And that credit-based pricing, what's nice is that suddenly opens, if you can get a single, payment system going across these different modes, I hope somebody's working on that, then, whether you go on to AC Transit in Oakland or you get onto BART or Muni or you get the bike share, you're seamlessly integrated with all those other modes, and you've got this money now helping you make those more rational decisions. Yeah. Excuse me. Right. So some of the bigger cities in China already have a single payment plan, which is wonderful. And yeah, I don't know what the limitation is here. Maybe it's because our government is slightly different. So do we need big buses anymore because we can have these sort of flexible jitney services running around driverless? And yeah, I absolutely expect to see that. I do expect to see some, perhaps driverless vehicles, although there's probably going to be somebody on board to keep, make sure nothing weird happens on that bus, to keep it clean and, fights from breaking out, all the rowdy bus users. On really heavy corridors, we can still see those same large buses, I think, but to penetrate these lower density neighborhoods that already exist, it's not this future sprawl thanks to automated vehicles or anything. I've long thought that wouldn't it be smart to just put a bunch of shared cars in those neighborhoods? They don't have to be new, the way most car sharing arrangements are right now, and that would do a lot for the accessibility of those households who have very distinctive travel patterns, very unique. Okay.
autopilot, but
So level 4, can you really not be there at all? Yeah, you cannot be there at all. It can self-drive to you, okay? I don't know that you'll be allowed to get drunk. Maybe if it's not in self-drive mode, the person on board has to be able to take over in the event of some kind of weird crash or other situation. So
they take over if they wanted to. Like if I'm in a hurry and I know this car should behave properly and I want to get there faster, and I say I'm taking over.
I think the auto manufacturers will still allow you to self-drive, partly because they don't want us to completely forget how to drive. But yeah, we'll become less good drivers, so there'll be even higher crash rates. But I think because of weather, winter storms, and other things, they need you to be able to maybe limp that vehicle out, not for the high-speed case that you necessarily want, but if there's really bad weather events or that something's disabled on the vehicle, they want somebody there to be able to take it. And one of the rules may be that the vehicle has to be occupied. Maybe it will not be allowed to self-park. And another rule I can see coming, in certain cities they may say, we're only allowing autonomous vehicles, so you better own one or share one or something, but we're not letting you pierce our downtown with a traditional vehicle because we don't want to hit any pedestrians, we want our lights to run a certain way. So that would institute a lot of change quickly in the fleet turnover. And you don't have to buy necessarily a new vehicle like Bosch and Google's, current, designs are like kits that would be added so you could retrofit existing fleets. So you could see the turnover faster than maybe an electrification of a fleet because it doesn't have to be a brand new vehicle.
Buses are even more than $1 per mile.
Right. Well, he's saying buses cost twice as much. Absolutely. This will be very competitive, I think. John in the back. My oldest brother, by the way, who showed up here.
Well, that'll be the last question.
Okay. Yes. I have no idea what the before-after learning is on cruise control. I know we have adaptive cruise control now, so that sounds like a no-brainer. That shouldn't the vehicle slow down if the vehicle in front of you has slowed down? So you've set it on 50 miles an hour or something, and suddenly traffic is emerging. Your vehicle should slow down even if you're looking away or looking at a cell phone, a smartphone. So I don't know. I haven't heard anything bad about cruise control, but I think adaptive cruise control is a real no-brainer for auto manufacturers. Now, do any of you have adaptive cruise control yet? Okay, so this is like a level 2 type technology. I think almost all of us have level 1. If you have a vehicle, you have electronic stability control. Many of the things, the vehicle is smart. It's helping us drive. Most of it's drive-by-wire. Anyway, the throttle controls and things like that. It takes our suggestions and then it tries to do it as intelligently as possible. So most of us are driving level 1 vehicles right now. Okay, is that the last question, Susan? I'll be here. You can still come up and ask me questions. And John, I'll see you soon so you can ask me more questions. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Is that okay on golf courses that you have special balls where they keep track of your balls?
Yeah, of course. My cat should know where she is.
And so, like, when you're driving your balls down the golf course, and when this thing figure the most efficient route to the next ball.
I don't know if that'll be illegal in the big league.
A stranger.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
just started construction.
Gorgeous.